Welcome to our study of Rinpoche Jigme Lingpa's Treasury of Precious Qualities. As always, kindly bring to this session of study the recognition of how this remedies the condition of suffering universally. If we look at how suffering happens all across the experience of sentient beings, it always comes back to this delusion of self that posits the experience, the object of experience, as other. And intrinsic to this is then the toxic condition of self-centering that spins off into the condition of confusion, samsara. So we recognize that the essential delusion that we suffer from precipitates, brings about a whole condition of suffering. And so with the practice of the Dharma, what we're doing is essentially connecting with reality. We're trying to sort of push aside all the veils that essentially obscures reality. And so the practice of the Dharma, all the aspects are really just coming down to this single place of eliminating confusion. So that's where, when we are engaging in the path, we're essentially cultivating the remedy for confusion, which is insight, wisdom, that we begin to see through appearances. And this we do through hearing the teaching, reflecting on it, critically understanding how the teaching connects with our immediate experience as individuals, as persons. And once we have that understanding, then understanding what it is that are the causes of suffering and what are the causes of bringing an end to suffering. And with that insight, then the integration of this is then the practice of meditation. So we cultivate this remedy for confusion through three aspects, what we call the three prajnas, or the three wisdoms, which is hearing the teaching, thinking critically about the teaching in the sense that seeing how it applies to us, and then the practice of meditation. So presently we are looking at the aspect of studying the teaching with the intention to see how this fits with us and also to inform our practice. So with that recognition, then we do this understanding really that we'd, or rather with the aspiration that we'd want to do this to get to the bottom of what causes suffering universally. So we're presently then looking at what are the favorable conditions for practice. Before I do that, actually, we start with invoking the blessing of Rinpoche Jigme Lingpa, the source of love and compassion for all beings, who knows all that is knowable, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind tamas, sky-like yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity. Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. So we are presently looking at then this stanza here, 50. And this is a summary of, so we're looking at four conditions, what we call the four wheels, which are really helpful in terms of us practicing the path. First is finding a good location. Second is finding a good teacher. Third is then aspiration. Fourth will be merit. But we've been looking at the teacher and the way in which we'd want to understand what is a good teacher, what it actually requires from us. And we've gone into quite some detail. Now we're arriving at the section that's called conclusion. So summing up really the essentials of how to engage with the second of what we call these four wheels, namely the teacher. So it says here, at first be skillful in examining a teacher, then be skillful in knowing how to follow him. At last be skillful in training in his view and action. Acting thus, you'll tread a perfect path. So the commentary then from Kangyur Rinpoche runs. So at the outset, you should keep your distance and make inquiries about the life of the teacher you wish to follow. Later, you should examine him or her more closely from a position that's not too far, but not too close either. Then you should participate in the teacher's activity skillfully, examining them carefully and in detail. If the teacher turns out to be someone who should not be followed, take your leave and go. But if the teacher proves to be the person you are seeking, stay and become a disciple. So this is where we, in our culture, we're challenged because we don't really have, you could say, a praxis within our culture of how to practically do this. So this is where the modern person really has to almost be doubly discerning, and the modern person is so ill-equipped to this. And that's where, again, it's really important to, if we can, and obviously if you're here, then this is the situation, to really listen to what you could say, the natives of Buddhist cultures, they again and again emphasize, which is to be so careful when engaging with a teacher, to take time. In the modern context, there's very much sort of a sort of sort of an excitement around a teacher. And very often the students will say, no, you must come and meet the teacher. The teacher is wonderful. And we might simply not have the chemistry with that teacher. It might not be our teacher. And that's where it's so helpful if we've sort of been brought up and we sort of have a natural sort of discerning and a natural capacity for sussing out and having some sensitivity. What is really a good teacher? And in addition to that, then once you could say, have some inkling that this could possibly be a good teacher, then we should stick around. First we should really, you could say, Google the teacher. It says here, make inquiries about the life of the teacher you wish to follow. So you should really see if there's some skeletons in the closets, particularly nowadays where there's so much, you could say, naivete around gurus, and just the strangest people, they end up being teachers. And that's where we'd want to make inquiries, ask others what their experience is, and really be discerning. And then we should begin to actually be around the teacher politely, not disturbing anybody, but just really sort of beginning to suss out what is the teacher. Is the teacher really, not only, it's not about us judging the teacher, well, to a large extent, yes, but also seeing if this is really someone that coincides with our temperament. It could be a teacher who's just not our type. It's very much like a marriage, you can say, to engage with a teacher. You take your time before fools rush in. So that's where it's important that we examine them more closely. And then if we decide not to study with the teacher, it doesn't mean matter what our friends they say or don't say. We should actually then just say, well, sorry, this is not something for me. Or if this teacher then is somebody that we really trust, or really, you'd say, possesses all the qualities that we've actually gone over in quite some detail. And elsewhere you find a lot of details around what is a proper teacher, what is a bad teacher. Then the next part is becoming a disciple. And that also we looked at, that also is very demanding. It's not just that we join MIT or UTS or Stanford or Harvard or what have you, but it's actually, once we get in there, then once we've gotten in, there might be very desirable to get in. We might be with a very desirable guru, but then the work begins. We actually, just as if we were engaging in a uni course or something, we engage wholeheartedly. We engage in study, we engage in practice. It's a big project, enlightenment. And so the way that you traditionally would do that is then become a disciple, in the sense that there's somebody you profoundly look to from the depth of your being as the embodiment of enlightenment. So there's then, it says here, subsequently, regardless how your teacher's behavior later appears to you, whether good or bad, you should be skillful in examining yourself, and you should persevere in your relationship. At that point, it's not so much about us looking at the teacher, is the teacher pleasing us or not? But at that point, we then need to also take into account what is happening with myself, and how is my reactions and so forth, and dealing with essentially our own, you could say, disposition, and taking very much, if we've decided that the teacher is someone that we completely trust, then we should begin to understand how a lot of what we experience are in fact our own projections. Now, as scary as this might sound, also, of course, the teacher also is very skillful in, a genuine teacher would be very skillful in also understanding the situation with the students. And that's where also the teacher wouldn't all of a sudden, you could say challenge the student's ability to manage his or her own projections with unless they're ready for it. And that's where the yes, we have this situation of a teacher trusting a student. If there really is trust, then the teacher also would really provoke insight and wisdom in the student, not from a selfish point of view, but from the point of view of compassion. So it's a very profoundly intimate, personal relationship we're engaging in. This is not like us signing up and then having, just like if we sign up for a sort of a university course, where all we're really engaging with when we do a uni course is data. We're assimilating data. We're getting information. That's not what the guru is about. To some extent, the data is what you can get from the middle management people like me. The sort of the filling in, the supplementing, all the sort of filling in this. But the teacher, that's not just about the data. That's very much about the character, the person, and that which is intangible. And that's where we then are not just looking at this relationship in terms of information and things that we should be getting and whatever. We're looking at something that is entirely intangible and is entirely about our personal path, not just to gain more information, but to gain enlightenment, to penetrate confusion and gain awakening. So there's a completely different, you could say, culture in place. There's a completely different way in place, which has to do with us working with our own mind, and the teacher really being seen as the reflection of our Buddha nature, manifesting externally, and you could say dosing out exactly the appropriate medicine according to what we need. At that point, everything the teacher says and does is seen as significant. We never ever think in terms of, oh, like of course, we engage with the teacher, making offerings and basically in every way enabling, you could say, a situation of openness with the teacher. Receiving so much, yes, we also offer so much, not in terms of material things, but really in terms of our own heart. And that's where then the student needs to be completely attentive to not indulging a sort of habitual view of the teacher as somebody else, as a person, and so forth. Again, in the context of particularly in the Vajrayana, then the teacher is seen really as the Vajradharas, as Guru Padmasambhava, as a sublime being. And that's where that's also why there's so much emphasis on, before you get involved with the Vajrayana, be careful. And again, within our culture, this is problematic in some of the hysteria around gurus. So that's why you need to really be sober and really sort of approach this in a cautious way, but intelligent way. And of course, there's everything to gain. There's temporary happiness and ultimate enlightenment. But it is very much then, if we engage in the Vajrayana, that's where we no longer view the teacher as just an ordinary acquaintance or an ordinary teacher. Until that we have it. We would say at the level of Hinayana, we would say the teacher is a wise elder. At the level of Mahayana, the teacher is a friend, somebody who actually knows us by name and who engages with us in a, you could say, very warm, wise way. But there's a greater sense of trust. Whereas with the Vajrayana, there's a complete surrender. There's a complete condition of devotion. And that enables something extraordinary to take place, which is then the discovery of co-emergent wisdom. So at the time of it, there's the openness of the student, the compassion of the teacher. That's where there can be this meeting of minds in the space of unconditional, you could say, the co-emergent wisdom that we were always born with. So that's where this situation holds such incredible potential and so much goodness, but it shouldn't be mistaken for some ordinary educational you could say process. It says then, Kangyur Rinpoche comments, finally, when you have received instruction and studied and meditated upon the view and action thus explained, you should be skillful in imitating your teacher's manner of thinking, speaking, and acting. So to some extent, this does mean that we monkey or emulate the teacher, but perhaps not too much. When we're talking about thinking, we more notice the sort of intangible dimension of the teacher's wisdom, which has a lot to do with kindness, a lot to do with sense of humor, warmth, and all of that. It's not that we sort of have to sort of align ourselves, yes, or Guruji likes, he likes, it has to be like this, it has to be like that. Maybe, but there's also a lot of space in the thinking of Guruji. And it's a lot more than just, it could be very speculative if we're trying to imagine what the teacher is thinking. So that's where it's much more about this, again, coming from a place of devotion where we gauge the teacher's wisdom and compassion. Speaking also, again, this has to do with the quality of the teacher's compassion in which the teacher engages with others. So it's not just repeating formulaically what the teacher is saying, but it's very much about having that same warmth and compassion in engaging with others. That inspires us, and that inspires our speech. And acting also, we could see the teacher's action is never frivolous. It's always, you could say there's a yogic quality to all these aspects of the physical, the mental, and the verbal. There's a quality of elegance, lightness, luminous brilliance that sort of permeates these aspects of body, speech, and mind. So that's where we would say the student is should be skillful in engaging the teacher's qualities. Next, the student should be skillful in attending the teacher, and finally, the student should be skillful in penetrating to the teacher's wisdom. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, disciples who act accordingly will make progress on the authentic path to enlightenment, unhindered by obstacles and without losing the way. So this is not just about us becoming followers, but this is also us as practitioners on the path to enlightenment, guided by someone who is capable of guiding us. So in 51, then Jigme Lingpa says, it's then that in their hate of peace, the evil spirits come, assuming human guise, deceitful in their dark and wicked ways. In hatred of bright virtue, they despise the holy beings. As much as you consort with them, the storm of sin will rage. How stupid then to keep such evil friends, who trample down the harvest of your virtue. For by these demon hordes you are brought low. So again, in the modern context, it's difficult. Of course, we're not just talking about people, because we're generally talking about Maras. And once we're on the path to enlightenment, if we're really serious about the path to enlightenment, then confusion begins almost to manifest ways in which it can hinder us eliminating confusion. So there will be all sorts of upheavals and obstacles that might manifest. And that's where it's very helpful if we're just determined and not swayed by circumstances. As far as us living in a non-Buddhist culture, mostly, it's not likely that we're going to find many people who are going to be really encouraging us to progress along the path to enlightenment. But at the same time, also, it really applies if we have compassion, if we're not swayed and so forth, this won't have any influence on us. So the main point really is that we're not in any way influenced, and that there's a compassion and understanding for these forces. And that applies no matter what. Even if we do say we trample on them, or we don't give into it, or we expel them and so forth, it really comes down to being effective in that. Really just means that we're just not giving into them. So then Kangyur Rinpoche comments, even so, when people give themselves to the practice of the true path, evil forces, demons, spirits, and the like, who hate everything related to peace beyond suffering, will appear in various human forms, family, friends, and even Dharma friends. behaving evilly and deceitfully. So if you read Matthew Ricard's, what is it? What is it again? The Art of Happiness, the key to life's most important skill, or something like that. You know, he starts off describing how in the modern discourse where he comes from, people think happiness, what a boring thing. You know, you know, how much interesting art would there emerge from happy people? You know, with the idea is kind of it would be nauseating if you had all these happy people, you know, playing harps and whatnot. You know, so that's where the sort of the the sort of modern left bank attitude is that, you know, if there's pain, then there's really interesting, you know, that you could say life that comes about. And who would want peace? So, of course, that's again just really semantics. And of course, at the end of the day, that particular style of thinking ultimately also is really just looking for happiness in just in another way. It's maybe not fluffy cotton candy happiness. Maybe it has to do with whips and chains or what have you, but it's at the same time driven by the same wish to achieve fulfillment, some gratification, recognition, or whatever. All the various things that we seek in terms of happiness. So at that point, what we're talking about here, peace beyond suffering, is the place where we actually have arrived at what we want. The only thing in the Buddhist context, we understand that acting on behalf of ego is just never going to work. And that's why we can look around us and see, yes, it just doesn't work. So even though the objective might be happiness, the way of engaging it is deeply confused. And so the objective of sentient beings and those on the path, they are in fact the same, but there's a lack of ability, a lack of skill in actually achieving that goal. And that's where you could very well say, in terms of our culture, there's a lot of negative forces that are definitely against, you could say, just being a peaceful and kind person. There's maybe not a lot of inspiration out there. But what we're also talking about is on the energy level, is actually when we direct ourselves towards the path and really are interested in persevering and awakening, then there's also, you could say, reactions from within in terms of various style, and you could say levels of energy, levels of our habitual patterns and so forth. And this, we would say, could also manifest externally in terms of outer phenomena. So again, that's where we, on one hand, can talk about a spiritual dimension of reactions, but we can also talk about how there are actual persons out there who might get in the way. So that's where Kangyur Rinpoche then refers to here, family, friends, even Dharma friends behaving evilly and deceitfully. So that's where it could come from all sides, really. This doesn't mean that we should be not swayed. It doesn't mean that we should respond with aggression or unkindness, but rather with compassion. But we should recognize that there is a confusion there that's not that helpful. And so Kangyur Rinpoche says, insofar as you associate with those who pursue the side of non-virtue, hating all that is virtuous, and despising and repudiating true spiritual masters, to that extent the storm of negativity will lay waste the harvest of learning and virtue that you had before. And that's why, of course, there is, and justifiably, many people who would say, oh, you're following a guru, you know, that's a very stupid thing to do. You know, gurus are bad people. And of course, you could say people are justified in believing this, and there's a lot of, you could say, insanity and abusive situations that have occurred. But that doesn't mean, just because we find so few rotten apples, and just because there have been, you could say, doctors who weren't practicing in a proper way, it doesn't mean the art of medicine and the possibility of genuinely compassionate, caring, and capable doctors isn't there. So that's why we should recognize, really, having found a precious teacher, having found a precious path, how important it is to persevere and not be swayed otherwise. So that's where we say here how unwise it is to keep evil company. It will prevent you from acquiring good qualities in the future, and you will be overwhelmed and ruined by demonic powers. the ultimate goal will be lost. Again, that's where it's very helpful if we could be with people who actually genuinely inspire us. And just when it comes to the evil company, just be aware of what potentially their ideas, what that potentially leads to. So 52 and 53 then reads, frequenting, therefore, virtuous teachers and good friends, you will gain perfect fortune in this very life. The Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas will at all times think of you. You will be rich in all excellence, in all the excellence of high birth and enlightenment. Accumulations all complete and obscurations purified, you will attain the two accomplishments, progressing from the high to higher qualities of grounds and paths. The practice of the Guru Yoga brings about the gathering of merit, and mingling your mind stream with the Guru's mind gives rise to primal wisdom. So for us to then associate with conducive company is very useful. And also it brings about a situation in which we have more a culture of actually doing what we truly want to be doing. And this brings about a situation of energy, a situation of being, you could say, feeling clean, feeling straightforward, just being honest and so forth. That's where there's, you could say, the force is with us. The Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are with us. And this leads to what we call temporarily high birth, meaning birth where there's little suffering, and ultimately complete freedom from samsara, enlightenment. And that's where, again, with the two things really that we are engaging in, and this is also implicit in the practice of Ngundro, the tantric preliminary practice, is really to perfect the accumulations and purify obscurations. So this brings about the two accomplishments of our own benefit and others' benefits. And particularly there, the culmination of the tantric preliminaries, the Ngundro, is the Guru Yoga. And that's where through these conditions of the accumulations perfected, the obscurations purified, and with the blessing of a teacher, then it's possible for us to then connect with what is the core of the teacher. And the only thing the teacher really wants to communicate to us is this unobscured condition that's basic to us, which we hadn't recognized. And even though it wasn't recognized, it's always been with us. So that primal wisdom we refer to as co-emergent wisdom, it's always been there. It was born with us. It never leaves us for a moment. And thus, ultimately, we could also say the Guru has always been with us and never left us for a moment. But now that we have the fortune of the Guru manifesting externally and guiding us. So the commentary reads, on the other hand, people who rely on a true, authentic spiritual master and keep the company of virtuous friends will enjoy physical and mental well-being, and in this very life, they will acquire all the marvelous qualities that derive from the Dharma of transmission and realization. The Dharma of transmission is the entire body of the Buddhist science, what we can learn. Realization is that the living tradition of realized persons that actually embody enlightenment. Kangyur Rinpoche continues, the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas will always think of them, of the people who practice in this way. In the immediate term, they will be richly endowed with the advantages of the higher realms and will finally achieve the ultimate excellence, enlightenment. They will complete the two accumulations here being the accumulation of merit, the accumulation of wisdom, purify the two obscurations, meaning the emotional and the cognitive obscurations, and thereby attain the supreme and common accomplishment. So the two accomplishments, sorry, I was saying that the accomplishment of benefiting self and other, but here it is. The common accomplishments are all the things that enable us to have power within, you could say, the relative reality. And the supreme accomplishment is enlightenment itself. So such individuals then gradually progress to the highest of the grounds and paths. Okay, there's a question here. or 2 maybe. Yeah. Someone says, I don't know where I read it, and I could be wrong, but wasn't there a tradition of observing the teacher for around 12 years before deciding? You know, it's one of these things that no, it's not really a tradition practically, but it is mentioned. I think it's in the Hevajra Tantra. It says, you know, you should observe a teacher for 12 years. It's rare that that actually happens, but it does imply that one should just spend one's time really examining the teacher. So it's tricky, but the implication is to just really be discerning. And so I understand we should have confidence and stop the examination of the teacher after receiving initiation into Vajrayana from a teacher. Would this occur once receiving the Ngundro, or is it after empowerment? When I read Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's work on Vajrayana, he indicated that Ngundro is actually Vajrayana, and as such we need to be aware of the ramifications, even entering into these preliminaries. It's true, Trungpa Rinpoche would, before he would teach Ngundro, he would actually have the students stay around for years. They'd have to sit, they'd have to study. Finally, they had to go through seminary, which actually lasted 3 months, and just being a lot of teachings and a lot of sitting and a lot of meditation. So that's where, at the end of that, they would then become Vajrayana persons and essentially begin the Ngundro. And that's why also at that point they'd be very motivated. But with other teachers, it's very often such that it's almost the first thing the student is given is Ngundro practice. And that can be good if the student really trusts the teacher and there really is, you could say, all the right circumstances there. So that's where, yes, when we then, but I would say at that point then we begin the Ngundro practice. We still are engaged with the study of the path, and we're still, you could say, somewhat new. And so it would really be after we had completed the Ngundro and then received Vajrayana empowerment that we then could, you would say, when we completed the Ngundro, or particularly actually already when we reached the Guru Yoga section, we'd want to be at a place where we would have an idea of who is our teacher and very much keep the teacher as the focus as we're doing the Guru Yoga. So this is again where it's a little bit gray zone as the Dharma in the transition between, you could say, the traditional Buddhist cultures and our modern context. Of course, within Tibet, then you would very often, you would already know who's worth relying on and who's not, and that sort of thing. So in a way, the modern situation leaves us fairly unprepared. Then again, it's not impossible either. And we do luckily have, and I would say where I'm sitting, from where I'm seeing things, we do have a fortune of connecting with genuine sublime beings. But of course, you shouldn't take my word for it. And there actually is, you are being encouraged to really doubt and investigate, analyze, and so forth. Regarding the highest of the grounds and paths, can you briefly explain ground, path, and fruit, and why are those categories important? Let me just see that line again. Yeah, ground, path, and fruit. I'll be happy to explain that, but let's just see. The highest. They will gradually progress. That just means that we'll succeed in the path. Yeah. But when you say ground, path, and fruit, we talk about the ground, which is where we are. Where we are is sentient beings that possess a core of enlightenment. And that's where we begin. We begin with that we are curable cases. And so that's where what the ground is, that we have Buddha nature. We then recognize, to begin with, we need to recognize how we are curable. And that's where we would say we need to understand how we, on one hand, project in a confused way, and on the other hand, there is a reality that's beyond confusion. And this we call the two truths. So we'd say all of the Mahayana is based on essentially the ground of the two truths. The path is then the two accumulations, which are then correspond again to the same levels. One is the accumulation of merit, within our relative experience and the accumulation of wisdom that connects us to the absolute truth. And that then leads to the fruition, which is then the two kayas, the Dharmakaya of wisdom and the Rupakaya of compassion. Okay. 54. Because the two accumulations are quintessence of the fruit, the conqueror has said that more than all the age-long worship of the Buddhas and their Bodhisattva heirs, more than 100 meditations on the generation stage, the recollection of the teacher for a single instant is supreme. So this applies then when we've met a genuine great teacher, and that's where there's such a difference. If we could study a lot and we could practice a lot and we could become calmer persons, you know, but we would still, you could say, just be conditioned by these circumstances. Whereas with the situation of meeting with somebody who's genuinely perfectly awake, the memory of the teacher takes us into a place that has nothing to do with, you could say, what is conditioned. And that's where we touch on something that is unconditional. That's where we talk about blessing. That's where we talk about then connecting with something that lies beyond the ordinary intellect. So that's where we'd say just keeping in mind, you know, we could just, you know, we could do so much spiritual practice and so on, and that's great. But sometimes even just being in the presence of a sublime being has an impact. Even persons who haven't practiced, just being in the presence of a sublime being, they're actually transformed without even practicing. So there is a living quality that can of awakening that resonates with this potential inside ourselves, that you could say trumps any kind of you could say gradual working with our gradual with our essentially our karmic condition, working with our, you could say, relative conditioning. And so there's a lot of really profound aspects of the path, but the most profound is that which really touches us deeply through this openness of devotion. So Kangyur Rinpoche then comments, if you practice Guru Yoga with faith and devotion, making offerings and singing praises, if you recite the mantra that invokes the teacher's mind and take empowerments, you will perfect the accumulation of merit. And if at the conclusion of this practice, while still a beginner, you mingle your mind with the teacher's mind in a single stream and rest evenly in that, or if you constantly preserve the understanding that all phenomena are primordially of the same taste in the sphere of the ultimate nature, you will perfect the accumulation of wisdom. So here we're very much talking about this quality of deep appreciation for the teacher, bhakti in the Indian tradition, and that's where we engage our body, our speech, and so forth in various ways, really, of connecting with this dimension through these sort of various ways in which we do that. And that's where we have all the various sort of practices of puja, of devotional song, and so forth. That brings about a shift within our, you could say, relative experience. And on top of that, if we could also then mingle with the teacher, or if we're able to sustain the undiluted condition, then yes, then we perfect what we call the accumulation of wisdom. So these two, one is, you could say, all that engages body, speech, and mind and transforms our relative being. That's the accumulation of merit. And then engaging with the wisdom that is free from any confusion whatsoever. That's the accumulation of wisdom. So these two accumulations. Kangyur Rinpoche's Guru Yoga is the quintessential method of completing the two accumulations by taking as the path the two kayas of the result. And that's where already presently, even though we haven't perfected or even though we aren't enlightened and we might not have complete realization of the Dharmakaya, we might not have can't manifest the body of compassion, the Rupakaya. Even so, when we're practicing Guru Yoga, then we are actually engaging the result in terms of the vision, the way that we see ourselves, see the environment, see the teacher, and so forth. And that way, both we combine the two kayas, both in terms of the way that we perceive all appearances, and in that way, we're both seeing phenomena according to how they actually are, the unity of appearance and emptiness. And in this way, the two kayas of the result are spontaneously present. We understand the purity of appearance, and we understand the purity of the intangible dimension of the Dharmakaya. And particularly then, we accumulate, as we can see here then, the two accumulations, like we saw before, the accumulation of merit and the accumulation of wisdom. For this reason, it said, the victorious one has said that to be mindful of the teacher for an instant is better than worshipping the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for many kalpas. So we could, of course, do some marvelous offering, but just that one moment of recollecting the undiluted quality of the teacher cuts through everything in terms of the ordinary conditioning. So it's also better than meditating on hundreds of generation stage practices, all the various aspects of meditation. If they lack this dimension, they don't take us that far. It's also said in the Dasha Chakra Sutra, if you serve the teacher with respect, you will acquire inconceivable merit. You should understand that all the excellent qualities and activities of Buddhahood derive from following the teacher. And in the Tantra Yishin Chogiju, it specifies to meditate on the teacher as the yidam above the crown of your head is 100 or 1,000 times greater than traversing the 3,000-fold universe with thousands of mandalas in your hands and dissolving them 1,000 times into your heart. So in other words, there's nothing really more profound than simply thinking of the teacher. If we feel we have 3 root gurus or more, do we visualize them as one? Well, that's why it's convenient that we can just think of Guru Rinpoche as embodying all of them. Yeah. So this completes then the second of the 4 wheels, and then we have the third, excellent aspiration. And aspiration is sometimes translated as prayer. Sometimes persons with theistic backgrounds, they object to the word prayer. And actually, Chogyam Trungpa, interestingly, he made sure his students, they never talked about prayer, because somehow Trungpa Rinpoche identifies this problem of theism as running very deep within his students. So, or maybe in the modern culture altogether, but certainly, or in Western culture, but certainly the term Tibetan Mönlam really means that we are aspiring. It's a path of aspiration. And so prayer is very often used, and we probably shouldn't be too worried about if we see the word prayer hovering around, particularly in Siddhartha intent context, and in most you could say Tibetan Buddhist context, the word Mönlam and Soldep is generally translated as prayer. But Trungpa Rinpoche actually would use aspiration for Mönlam, and Soldep he would say supplication. But anyway, aspiration really is this practice of setting, you could say aspiring and setting a direction to our mind, giving our minds, you could say, a purpose. So 55 then reads, the perfect aim to bring into your mind the treasury of boundless streams of nectar of the sacred teaching hangs upon the exposition of a perfect teacher, by whose perfect skillful means the pith instructions will not err. The perfect resolution to gain freedom is a strong enchantment cast upon the demon of contentment with samsara. With these four perfections is your aspiration excellent. So okay, we'll look at that. Okay, the essence of excellent aspiration is an earnest wish to practice the teachings. It involves the application of 4 perfect principles. The first of these is the perfect aim, namely the wish to assimilate by means of the 3 kinds of wisdom, the ones we talked about earlier through hearing, thinking critically, and meditating. Through these 3 kinds of wisdom, we then wish to assimilate the supreme Dharma of transmission and realization. Again, all the teachings that come down from the Buddha, say the theory, and the realization, the actual experience, which we can then see manifest in our teacher. So in this way, that is our perfect aim. That is our goal, that unfathomable oceanic treasury of immortal ambrosia. So this is what heals the condition of samsara. This in turn depends on the perfect teacher, learned in the sutras and tantras, and unmistaken in the exposition of them. So this is someone who perfectly has studied all the sutra teachings, all the teachings of what we refer to as the 3 Pitakas, the teachings on the Vinaya, the lifestyle, the teaching on the spiritual instruction, the sutras, and also the teachings on the science, the Abhidharma, and understanding really how the sutra vehicle gradually eliminates confusion and gradually unveils enlightenment. And particularly then the tantras is then the understanding of how the abiding nature is spontaneously present within every sentient being as deity, and understanding how to invoke this and knowing how to instruct this, and give empowerment and so forth. So that's where the perfect teacher has the foundation of all the sutra teachings, as well as also the perfect understanding and skill in the practice of the tantras. And it not only has these, as you say, qualities, but is also skillful in explaining this to others, knowing the nature of the others and appropriately giving teachings according to the student's disposition. Third, the disciple must employ the perfect method, the whole array of conceptual practices, generosity and so on. So that's where when we say generosity and so on, we mean this practice of the 6 paramitas. So that's where we need to be skillful in. When we mean method, it's really that which engages who we are presently and makes that a vehicle for enlightenment. And that's why presently, us being conceptual individuals, we need conceptual practices that then take us beyond the conceptual. But that's where then the practice of generosity and so forth, discipline, patience, energy, meditation, and finally prajna, it is what gradually takes us beyond conceptual constructs, and whereby the desired goal is attained and the wisdom of the profound stages of generation and perfection, and that's what's referred to in the root verses as pith instructions, is kept from distortion and decline. And that's why all the instructions that we then have in a Vajrayana context of the development stage practices and the completion stage practices, that they actually remain living within us. Fourth, the perfect determination to be free from samsara is a powerful enchantment cast over the demon of complacency, by means of which each and every practice will propel one further along the path to liberation. And that's where this determination, what we sometimes refer to as renunciation, that is something that you could say overcomes the demon of complacency. We might sort of be complacent, not terribly disenchanted with samsara, and so forth. And that's where there's still, you could say, the demon still has a powerful presence within us. And that's where we numb that sort of voice of ignorance, or we enchant it. We manage to sort of sequester it. I don't know. damage control. We managed to sort of, it's an interesting formulation here. Yeah, we managed to deal with it. And through doing that, then we can progress along the path. I don't understand how an instant of recalling the teacher is worth so much more than kalpas of worshipping the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Good question. What is the quality of the recollection that is so powerful? What is happening in the recollection that is not happening with traditional veneration of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? Well, you could say if we are venerating the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas with deep veneration, it's probably not that bad either, I'd like to say. But the point really here is more on the affirmative, the assertion that this moment of recollecting the teacher touches us very deeply. So that's really the point that's being made here. So that's where when we talk so highly about the moment of the teacher, it's not just that the teacher, you could say, is external as everything that's praiseworthy, which the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas obviously are. But it's the teacher, the presence of the teacher touches something from within. I don't know if you remember in the Mipam Rinpoche, the last chapter of Mipam Rinpoche talks about wisdom arising from behind, from in front, and from within. And in this case, when we say from behind, it's like it gradually just takes place with us. It's sort of just, you could say the main, you could say what's mainly is occupying is our ordinary concept. And within that, then our, you could say, practice of the path with its two accumulations still is somewhat stumbling in the dark. And that's really what's implicit here, even though we are, you could say, being, you could say, virtuous, worshipping Buddhists that venerate the Bodhisattvas. There's still a lack of clarity. And so that's where the tantras then they invoke, and particularly when we say the guru yoga in the sense of the guru in front or the guru out there is something that then brings present, then what does enlightenment look like? See, with the more sort of, you could say, abstract sense of worshipping the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it's not quite clear exactly what enlightenment is. Whereas with the teacher, it is. That's where there's a palpable experience of human interaction, where we see something extraordinary in someone else. So that's where it's a lot less abstract. And there's also a place then with when we mingle with the teacher's wisdom, that there is this sense of the wisdom arising from within, that the teacher is not just out there, but also sort of is within us. Does that make sense? This is rather an important point, and it really is that upon which you could say the Bodhisattva, the Vajrayana is based. And of course, also if we really were, you could say, present with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but it's very often then when we say the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it's a little bit sort of abstract. It's a little bit sort of there's a little bit more theism taking place in the sense that there's some absolute principle out there, whereas the teacher is very, very immediate. Okay, good. Very real, sort of, yeah. Okay, let's take the next one. 56. To enter Dharma's door, but then grow weary. To study, contemplate, and meditate with poisoned motivation. To have no true commitment to the Dharma. Holding vows as though they were a burden. To wander from the practice of the Mahayana. Cursed by 8 mundane concerns. All these are grievous faults, whereby persistence in the excellent aspiration is destroyed. So again, we need to sort of humbly take into account where we could possibly have shortcomings. And unless we do that, then these things can sort of creep under our skin and sort of take over unnoticed. So that's where we, as I'm always repeating so much in the Buddhist teaching, we're very onto how habitual patterns, ego, and so forth, they can very much sort of get into the mix. So we've just looked at these 4: perfect aim, perfect teacher, perfect method, and perfect determination to be free from samsara. The contrary of these four principles is a grudging practice of the Dharma, engaging in it through a sense of obligation imposed by a spiritual friend or someone else. So if we sort of reluctantly engage in the Dharma, it's a bit of a slog. Some people, for example, may adopt the external tokens of the saffron robes and so forth, but they are bored by the teachers and studies, however light and undemanding they may be. And that, of course, is something that is, you could say, very prevalent within Buddhist cultures when it's just, what you do. It's a bit like, kids that go through college just because, they have to, and stuff like that. And even if this is not the case, no matter how much they learn, reflect, and meditate, if their motivation is contaminated by a poisonous concern for this life, material gain, reputation, and so on, the result will only ever be a continuation of samsara. So that's why if you hit on the sort of the career of being a lama or a learned scholar or whatever, and think, well, I could sort of become famous and gain a sweet renown and so forth, then this is in no way really extricating ourselves from the cause of suffering. Kangyur Rinpoche says this is a situation totally opposed to the path of freedom. Alternatively, perhaps, although the Dharma is the last thing they think about, there are some people who are too inhibited to contravene the instructions of the spiritual master or their Dharma friends. And so they carry the precepts and vows around with them as a burdensome duty. This is where they're just doing it as a complete slog. This shows that they are motivated by 8 worldly concerns. The concerns about, praise and blame, loss and gain, pleasure and pain, and so forth. I can't remember all of them. But anyway, they're all summed up in what we call hope and fear. I really should learn it by heart. It's terrible. Anyway, hope and fear sums it all up. Even though, to all appearances, they act for the sake of others and the teachings, their Mahayana path is overthrown. So that's again just acting the part, but there's no real depth. It is as though a powerful sorcerer were to provoke a disaster, calling down curses to stop the rain and induce a drought. The 8 worldly concerns are indeed like the face of Rahu, which eclipses the bright autumn moon, a symbol of the determination to persevere in one's excellent aspiration. So that's where something just obscures us, these hopes and fears. When we have an eclipse in the, I think it's all across Asia, but certainly in India and in Tibet, it's seen that it's actually Rahu, who's a spirit, sort of a planetary force, that is actually eating away at the moon. So at that time, actually, one would, even when you have a lunar eclipse, you would actually stay up and do mantras. I remember once Jakob Rinpoche, he kept us up all night chanting Vajraguru mantra because there was a lunar eclipse. And all around the Bodhnath Stupa, I remember they were clanking the bells, and all through the night there was just a lot of activity to really ward off negativity. So that's when there's this lunar eclipse that that is here then a symbol of the darkening of the determination to persevere in the Dharma. Yeah. Rahu is headless. Ah, interesting. So what's going on there? That's right, isn't it? Because when we see Rahula, there's eyes all over, right? But he does have a head. That's interesting. Yeah, maybe, yes. Do you want to look into it? Do some research on this? Okay. Yeah, because in the Buddhist context, we have one of the Dharmapalas is called Rahula, and he has a face on his belly. So there is obviously some sense of the face being elsewhere, but he's also seen as having a head of sorts. So yeah. Okay, yeah, check it out. Be interesting. What is the story? Yeah. But it is this idea that the moon is being eaten by Rahu. Okay. So basically also then something is obscuring our path. So that, anyway, the implication here is the sort of the lack of genuine motivation. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.